Wells of Silence by TheBeckster, Chapter 8, 20 Weeks. Padme turned away from the man seated next to him, setting his plate on the table so he could refill his drink. His heart pounded in his ears and his throat was dry. He was nervous and feeling somewhat guilty about playing Clovis. They had been friends once, more than friends, actually. Rush had every intention of rekindling that relationship. Padme had been subtly putting him off all night, but he could only be so blunt. He had to figure out this mess with the banking clan, and keeping Clovis in a good mood was key to that. Still, there was a line he would not cross. Rush was very intent on crossing that line, constantly reminiscing on how well they had worked together before the war. When that didn't raise the response he was hoping for, Clovis turned to talking about Anakin. "We're just friends," Padme responded quickly. He hated how easily and convincingly the lie slid off his tongue. "Friends don't argue the way I saw you two arguing this afternoon." Rush's voice turned slightly into soft concern. "We've been friends for a long time," Padme insisted. He reached for the decanter and refilled his glass. "She just didn't want to see me get hurt again." While Padme was distracted with his drink, Clovis reached forward, cupping Padme's face in one hand while the other pulling his close. "Then there's no reason that we can't." He pressed their lips together. Padme barely had a shocked second to register what was happening before an enraged voice came from the door. "Get your hands off of him!" Clovis was roughly pulled off the couch by invisible hands. He was thrown into an empty table and fell to the floor with a crash of broken pottery. Padme whipped towards the door and instantly recognized the dark-robed figure of his wife. She was livid, seething, and ready for a fight. She closed the distance in a few long strides. "Anakin, don't!" Padme scrambled to place himself between his wife and Clovis, but he was too slow. She grabbed Rush by the lapels, lifted him off the floor, and wound up for a punch. Clovis wasn't going down without a fight, though. She hit him once, but he blocked Anakin's second swing. He swung out with his legs. Anakin was too fast for him and stepped away, but lost her hold on him. Rush struck a few times. Anakin dodged and parried his blows. Padme managed to step in, shoving Clovis back a few feet and grabbing his wife's arm. "Stop it, both of you. Anakin, you shouldn't be fighting." She shook him off, but the momentary hesitation cost her. Clovis rushed forward, intending to tackle her. Anakin's stance was sturdy, and she was only knocked back a few steps, but it didn't matter because Clovis released her with a shocked gasp. He stumbled back, looking not at her face, but at her stomach. You're... His eyes flicked from Anakin to Padme and back again. "You two?" Anakin's face twisted in rage, and she hit him square across the jaw before he could finish his thought. Clovis dropped to the floor in a dead faint. "Anakin, what were you thinking? Are you out of your mind?" Padme shouted, pushing her away from Clovis by a few steps. "I could ask you the same thing," she yelled back, stepping away from him. "I'm not pregnant, and I wasn't found kissing another man." Padme's retort was cut off by his calm chirping. "Senator Anidala, are you all right?" Typho's voice asked. "We heard a commotion." "No, get in here." The words hardly left Padme's mouth before Typho and two other security guards rushed into the room. Typho's eyes swept the room, and taking note of the unconscious Clovis on the floor. 2 officers rushed to his side. Someone attacked us. They came in from the balcony and took off on a speeder, Padme explained frantically. If Knight Skywalker hadn't showed up when she did, they might have killed Senator Clovis. The second guard stood up and ran to the balcony, vainly searching the sky for a suspicious-looking speeder. Did you recognize them? Typho asked, looking to Anakin. She crossed her arms tightly. No. Sir, he's coming around, the guard by Clovis's side said. Rush stared weakly, moaning lowly in pain. Padme gave Anakin a sharp warning glare before kneeling next to Clovis. Take it easy, Rush. You've been knocked unconscious. He was helped to sit up slowly. One hand gingerly touched his jaw. Senator Amidala told us what happened. Senator Clovis, did you recognize your attacker? Rush blinked barely for a moment before his gaze sharpened. He looked first to Padme and then Anakin, and then Typho. No, I didn't. A med droid is on its way, Senator, the guard from the balcony announced, having given up on his speeder search. Thank you. Help me get Clovis to the bedroom. The 2 guards lifted Clovis to his unsteady feet and led him deeper into the apartment. Padme rose with them and gave Anakin a sharp look before following after them. Anakin stayed where she was, rooted to the spot by the angry, betrayed look on in her husband's eyes. If anyone should be feeling betrayed, it was her. She tersely answered a few more of Typho's answers, giving vague descriptions of the attacker and speeder. He would go report the attack to the Coruscant police. They'd be on the lookout for the supposed attacker. They'd never find anyone. After Typho and his guards left, Anakin wandered through the apartment and out to the veranda. She sank down onto one of the steps, propping her arms up on her knees and watching the sky traffic flow past. The children squirmed in her belly, and she had a brief, nauseating moment of fear. She could have hurt them. She could have let something terrible happen to them, all because she couldn't trust Padme. Then her anger returned. Padme had willingly put himself in Clovis's hands. He had allowed himself to look available for the separatist. He had kissed Clovis. She felt her husband approach and stop a good 10 feet behind her. The med droid is here. Do you need to see it, Anakin? No, I'm not hurt. She turned and looked at her husband and finally saw what he was wearing. He was dressed nicely, too nice for what should have just been an evening with friends. He never dressed like that for her anymore. It only made her anger burn brighter. Can I explain, Anakin? Padme asked, sitting next to her. Be my guest, because I'd love to know why I walked in on you kissing someone else. Padme flinched at her harsh tone, but countered with his own sharp tongue. Fine, but you'll have to explain to me why you put yourself and our children in danger by attacking someone who may have been armed. Anakin winced too, but glared at her husband. You first. Pay attention then, because I know you can tell when I'm lying, Padme snapped. Then he took a deep breath. I didn't kiss Clovis voluntarily. He forced it on me just as you walked through the door. I didn't even have a chance to react before you stepped in. He sighed and softened his tone. You know I love you, Anakin. Truly, deeply, dearly. You are the only person in the entire galaxy that I love, that I want to spend the rest of my life with, that I dream of having a family with. I would never do anything to throw that away. Anakin looked away from the earnest expression in her husband's eyes. He was speaking true. It made her feel even worse. Her anger burned away quickly. When I saw you with Clovis in his arms, I don't know what came over me. I was just so afraid that he was going to take you away from me. He might have been planning on killing you or trying to seduce you. I don't know. I just lost control. I couldn't stand seeing you there in his arms. Padme tried to place his hand over Anakin's, but she flinched away from his touch. He settled for placing it on her knee instead. I would never leave you, Anakin, or our children. See, you say that, and now I'm afraid you're only staying for the baby's sake. Padme frowned and pulled away. Do you doubt me that much? No, I'm just terrified. I can't lose you, Padme. I don't know what I'd do without you. Padme reached out again, this time catching Anakin's left hand in his own hands. He worked his fingers into her clenched fist and felt her relax as he intertwined his fingers with hers. I'm not going anywhere, Anakin. You won't lose me. I love you always and forever. Anakin leaned against her husband. I know. I love you too, she sighed heavily. Sometimes I'm just afraid that all this secrecy and deception will be the end of us. We knew that building this marriage on a foundation of lies and secrecy was going to be difficult, Anakin, but that doesn't mean it's not worth the effort. A heavy silence settled over them. Anakin didn't feel at all better. Her anger had burned out, but it still smoldered in the pit of her stomach. She knew Padme was still going back to work with Clovis. He had to, as much as she didn't like it, and she was stuck on Coruscant, unable to help at all, completely useless. Do you want to just leave? Padme asked quietly. What? Just pack a bag and run away together. We could go back to Naboo, back to the lake. Nobody would know we were there. We could be a family together, finally. We can't leave, Padme. Somebody would find us. The Jedi, Separatists, Senate agents, someone would find us and ruin everything. We can't really hide. Padme sighed. Yeah, I guess you're right. Still, when this is all over, when the war is done, I want us to be together. Just me and you and our children and our love. That's all I'll need. That sounds nice, Anakin agreed softly. She enjoyed another moment of just feeling Padme next to her, supporting her, loving her. Suddenly, she sensed movement in the back of the apartment. She had almost forgotten about that particular thorn in her side. She stiffened and stood up. I should go. Clovis shouldn't find me here with you, and I can't guarantee that I won't hit him again if he makes threats. She reluctantly pulled her hand out of Padme's and hopped into her speeder. They exchanged a final I love you before she sped off back to the temple. Anakin leaned against the wall where Padme's Senate pod had recently been sitting. She watched scowling as Clovis gave his speech and provided evidence for the corruption of the banks. Mas Ameda called for a vote to put Clovis in charge of the banking clan. The results came in overwhelmingly in his favor. Anakin frowned, unable to ignore the nauseating feeling in the pit of her stomach. This was not going to end well for anyone. She uncrossed her arms and walked away, knowing the Chancellor would be expecting her to wait in the sub-level office his own pod rested in. She could have heard the news quite plainly from down there, but she just wanted to keep her eyes on Clovis. She didn't like the way that Clovis put a warm hand on Padme. She did like the cool way Padme pulled away a lot more. She followed Palpatine and his entourage in her usual place. Now, at the Chancellor's right hand, he had already given Mas Ameda his instructions as well as his aides. Now began the long walk back to his offices. Palpatine always liked to make appearances in the halls after a large Senate decision. Rather than taking the direct lift, He said that it gave the other senators the feeling that he was open and approachable. Rarely did anyone approach him with a dispute in the halls, though. The set of armed guards were more than a little off-putting. Anakin, my dear, I know that recent events have been rather trying for you. I've known you far too long to know that when something is bothering you, the Chancellor said in a gentle, kind voice. Anakin always thought of it as his teaching voice. It seemed to carry the same tone as the Jedi Masters did when she was a young apprentice with a lot of catching up to do. He paused and made eye contact with a group of senators as they passed in the hall. He stated his next words bluntly. I don't trust Clovis. Anakin furrowed her brow. That seemed rather hypocritical considering the speech he just gave in favor of Clovis. But Chancellor, Palpatine was quick to explain, still in his calm manner, I may have supported him publicly and politically. It was the right move for the Republic. This mess with the banks must be settled. They stopped as they rounded a curve in the hall. Clovis and Padme were talking to a few other senators, no doubt receiving well wishes for the success of Clovis' takeover. But personally, Palpatine continued, I distrust him. I think there is something else we aren't seeing with Clovis. I can only hope that whatever it is will not affect our great Republic. Anakin definitely agreed. She was privately relieved that Palpatine disliked Clovis as well. There was something going on with the Separatists, something more than her personal dislike for him. She just hoped Padme would get out of the situation before things turned for the worse. She didn't want her husband to get hurt again. Anakin was getting really tired of her husband being sent off to Scipio. At least this time he was given a regiment of clones to accompany him. All he had to do was oversee the transfer of power, make sure Clovis didn't do anything sneaky in the next 2 days, and then he'd finally be home free. He'd be able to wash his hands of this whole mess and leave the banking to the accountants. In fact, Padme should be contacting the Chancellor any minute now to report on the power transfer. On cue, Padme's hologram flashed to life before the Chancellor's desk. He looked less than happy. Anakin's heart pounded nervously. His news wasn't good. Clovis had raised the interest rate of the Republic's loans. He hadn't touched the Separatists. Anakin swallowed her rising smug wave of I told you so. Now wasn't the time or the place. It wasn't even a triumphant feeling, knowing she had been right. In this case, she wished she could have been wrong. Palpatine called a Senate meeting. Anakin informed the council of the changes on Scipio. Both Master Yoda and Master Windu insisted on accompanying her to the session to observe. They watched from Padme's empty pod. Palpatine reported what had transpired. The outcry was immediate. Many felt betrayed. Others had their fears vindicated. Correct you were, it seems, distrusting Clovis, Yoda told Anakin, not taking his eyes off the Senate floor. It is unwise for Clovis to make a move such as this so early. He will turn the whole Republic against him, Windu added. Unclear are his objectives, Yoda mused. Want this? He might. No, Anakin shook her head and looked out to the Chancellor's platform. It doesn't make sense. Something is wrong. It wasn't long after the reports of a separatist invasion of Scipio came in. Padme himself warned the Chancellor. Anakin nearly broke something when droids ambushed and captured him mid-call. Palpatine immediately ordered Mas Amedda to invoke an emergency Senate meeting. The Chancellor hardly seemed fazed by the turn of events. It almost felt to Anakin as if he had been expecting this to happen. He turned to her as soon as Mas Ameda was out of the room. Normally, you would be my first choice to send to fend off the Separatists, Anakin. Who would you suggest lead the attack? General Kenobi would be my first choice. Palpatine nodded in agreement. Inform the council, my dear. Oversee the preparations of the Armada. Pick the best general under my instructions. We must retake the banks from the Separatists, or the Republic will crumble. Anakin bowed sharply and walked away quickly. Obi-Wan and his troops were almost ready to deploy anyway. Their R&R was up, and they were supposed to ship out tomorrow morning. By the time they got organized and ready, the Senate vote would be in, and they could take back Scipio. They could rescue Padme. Obi-Wan was more than willing to lead the attack on Scipio. Anakin oversaw the preparations of the Armada with him. It hadn't taken very long and everything was ready. Now they were just waiting for the Chancellor's word to launch. They stood outside the docking port of the command cruiser. Anakin tried to look like she wasn't anxious to get on the ship herself and rescue Padme. Obi-Wan knew better. I know you are worried for Senator Anidala, Anakin. He placed a hand on her shoulder, squeezing reassuringly. He's in the hands of the Separatists. Clovis betrayed him. He might not survive this. I will do what I can to get Padme back alive, Anakin. You have my word. She was saved from having to come up with a positive response by her calm chirping. Mace Windu's voice came through. The Senate has voted in favor of attacking the Separatists on Scipio. Launch the fleet when ready. That's my cue, Obi-Wan said dryly. He gave Anakin's shoulder one last reassuring squeeze. We'll be back soon, Anakin. Try not to worry. I hate this, Anakin hissed, dropping into her seat by the Chancellor's desk. Palpatine looked at her sympathetically. I know, my dear, you were never meant for the passive side of war. Sitting and waiting is unfitting for an energetic person such as yourself. I should be there with them, not stuck here being useless. No offense, Chancellor. None taken, my dear. Palpatine waved his hands dismissively. You are a fighter, Anakin, and if you weren't currently in such a vulnerable condition, you would have been my choice to lead the attack. But, my dear, I would feel truly awful if anything happened to you. It just feels wrong to be on this side of the war. Anakin had taken no less than 10 laps around this floor of the Senate building ever since she got back from seeing Obi-Wan off. She had hoped they would help burn off some of her nervous energy and frustrations. They hadn't helped at all. This was really the first mission with personal ties that she hadn't been allowed to accompany. She thought she would have been okay. She wasn't. Luckily for Anakin and everyone else's nerves, preliminary reports said that the Separatist fleet had left almost as soon as the Republic had shown up. All they had to do was retake the capital from the droids, rescue Padme, and bring Clovis into Republic custody. It was going to be a very short battle. Padme would be home by nightfall. Still, it had been several hours. There should have been another report by now. Mas Ameda stepped into the office, bowing respectfully to the Chancellor. We have a report coming in from General Kenobi, Chancellor. Excellent. Send it through. Anakin was relieved to see both Obi-Wan and Padme flicker to life before her eyes in hollow form. Obi-Wan looked as he always did when giving a report, a nearly unreadable neutral expression. Padme, on the other hand, looked subdued, head bowed, hands folded, and hanging low, mournful. Thankfully, neither of them seemed hurt. Chancellor, the Separatists' forces have abandoned Scipio. The fleet fled, the orbit is cleared. We are working on clearing out the remaining droids from the planet. Good. What of the state of the banks? Irreparable damage has been done. Clovis betrayed us, cut deals with the Separatists. He was the root of the corruption all along, Padme stated dully. But the banks are now in the control of the Republic. And what of Clovis? Is he in custody? I am afraid Rush Clovis is dead, Obi-Wan stated solemnly. Anakin couldn't help but feel a small thrill of satisfaction of that. Clovis had gotten what was coming to him. He was through putting Padme in danger, and their secret had died with him. She immediately felt sick and guilty for that train of thought, though. An unfortunate turn. He should have seen justice for his actions, Palpatine said, ever the voice of reason. We will leave forces here to defend Scipio, Obi-Wan continued. The remainder of the Armada is returning to Coruscant. Excellent, General Kenobi, Senator Amidala. We await your safe return. Anakin waited anxiously behind the large pillars of one of the Senate building's many docking areas. Obi-Wan and Padme were going to meet the Chancellor and several other senators here. A brief reception before they were shuffled to another emergency Senate session, hopefully the last one for a while. The waiting group included the Chancellor's usual entourage as well as Senator Organa, the Mun senator from Scipio, and a few others Anakin couldn't remember the names of. She hadn't actually been invited to wait for Obi-Wan and Padme. In fact, Palpatine had asked her to wait for Obi-Wan to come to his office and then go report to the temple. But she wasn't going to put off seeing her husband a moment longer than necessary, and she could get back to the Chancellor's offices much faster than this group could. She heard the hum of a transport engine's wind down as one landed at the dock. She peeked around the pillar and saw her husband and Obi-Wan disembark. She quickly shielded herself, hoping Obi-Wan wouldn't notice her presence. They were greeted by the group and led back into the building. Anakin followed, dodging behind columns and hoping Padme would see her. Finally, Padme excused himself from the group, mentioning the need to run to his office before the Senate session. He waited until the remainder of the entourage walked far away, before turning on his heel and sprinting back to Anakin. She took her husband into her arms, wrapping him in a warm, strong embrace. I'm sorry, Annie, I'm so sorry, he sobbed into her chest. Anakin could feel the fear and grief rolling off him. I should have listened to you. Anakin squashed the petulant corner of her mind that wanted to snap back. Yeah, you should have. Instead, she gently walked them back a little further into a column shadow and comforted her husband. End of chapter.